The rattlesnake's warning came too late as Orion Rhodes stared down the barrel of a revolver, dust swirling around his worn boots in the scorching Arizona territory of 1878. Death had come calling many times before, but never had it worn such a beautiful face. "You're standing on my claim, mister," the woman said, her voice steady as the gun in her hand. The sun cast her auburn hair in a fiery halo, her eyes narrowed with determination. "I mean no harm, madam," Orion replied, slowly raising his hands, "just passing through." "That's what they all say," she countered, not lowering her weapon. "Then they help themselves to whatever they please." Orion had been riding for 3 days with little rest, his destination nowhere in particular. The past 5 years since Sarah's death had been a blur of cattle drives, bar fights, and endless trails leading away from the pain that followed him like a shadow. "Name's Orion Rhodes," he offered. "Didn't ask," she replied, but after a moment added, "Amelia Hayes." The claim was modest, a small cabin with a partially constructed barn beside it, a creek running nearby. It was the kind of place Orion had once dreamed of having with Sarah before the fever took her. "You're working this claim alone?" he asked, noting the half-finished construction and tools scattered about. "That's none of your concern." Amelia's stance remained rigid, but Orion could see the fatigue in her eyes. "Look, I'm just a cowboy heading north. I can be on my way, or—" he hesitated. "Or I could offer a day's work for a meal. That barn looks like it needs another pair of hands." Amelia studied him, doubt plain on her face. "What's a cowboy doing so far from any herd?" "Not all who wander are lost, madam," he said with a hint of a smile. "Some of us just haven't found a reason to stop yet." The gun lowered slightly. "One wrong move, Rhodes, and you'll be meeting your maker." "Fair enough." That evening, after hours of hauling lumber and setting posts for the barn, Orion sat at Amelia's rough-hewn table, devouring a bowl of stew. It wasn't fancy, but it was the first home-cooked meal he'd had in months, and it warmed more than just his belly. "This is mighty fine cooking, Miss Hayes." "Mrs.," she corrected, was Mrs. Hayes. Orion nodded, understanding the weight of that was. He'd carried the same burden since burying Sarah outside Tucson. "My condolences." "Don't need 'em," she replied sharply, then softened. "Jacob's been gone 2 years now, shot by claim jumpers while I was in town for supplies." "That why you greet strangers with a gun?" She offered a small, sad smile. "Partly, also because a woman alone out here might as well have a target on her back." Orion nodded. The frontier was hard on everyone, but especially so for women without protection. "You've done well for yourself, all things considered." "Had no choice," Amelia said, refilling his bowl without being asked. "Jacob had dreams of striking it rich, said there was gold in that creek. I haven't found more than a few flecks, but this land." Her eyes drifted to the window where the setting sun painted the landscape in brilliant oranges and purples. "This land is worth something." Orion followed her gaze. The view reminded him of the plot he and Sarah had staked near the Gila River, where they'd planned to raise horses and children. All those plans had died with her. "Why'd you offer to help?" Amelia asked, interrupting his thoughts. "Seemed like the right thing to do." "Men don't often do the right thing without expecting something in return," Orion shrugged. "Maybe I just needed to be useful to someone for a change." Amelia studied him with those piercing eyes that seemed to cut through pretense. "You're running from something?" It wasn't a question, but Orion answered anyway. "Aren't we all?" The next morning, Orion prepared to leave, tightening the cinch on his saddle as Amelia watched from the porch. "That offer stands," she said suddenly. 2 weeks of work on the barn and clearing the south field, food and a place to sleep in exchange. Orion paused. The sensible thing would be to keep moving. Staying in one place too long meant putting down roots, and he'd sworn off that kind of attachment after Sarah died. "I'm not looking for permanent work, Mrs. Hayes, and I'm not offering it," she replied evenly. "Just 2 weeks." Something in her expression, determination, mixed with a vulnerability she was trying hard to mask, made the decision for him. 2 weeks, he agreed. Days passed in a rhythm of hard work. They labored side by side, Orion on the barn and Amelia tending her small garden and livestock. Conversations were sparse at first, limited to necessities. but gradually they began sharing more. During their evening meals, Orion learned that Amelia had come west from Missouri with her husband 4 years ago, full of hope and ambition. Jacob Hayes had been a dreamer, always chasing the next big strike, certain that fortune lay just over the next hill. He'd talk for hours about what we'd do once we were rich, Amelia recalled, a sad smile playing on her lips as they sat on the porch after a long day's work. A big house in San Francisco, fine clothes, maybe even travel to Europe. "And what did you want?" Orion asked. The question seemed to surprise her. "No one ever asked me that before," she thought for a moment. "I just wanted a home. Something solid that couldn't be packed up and moved every time a new rumor of gold surfaced. And now you have it." "Yes, though not how I imagined." She looked at him. "What about you? What does Orion Rhodes want from life?" The question hit him harder than he expected. "I used to know." As the days passed, Orion found himself sharing his own story, how he'd met Sarah when he was working cattle in Texas. How they'd married young and headed west with dreams as vast as the territory itself. He told Amelia about the small plot they'd claimed, the horses they'd planned to breed, the house they'd started to build. "What happened?" Amelia asked gently one evening as they watched the sunset. "Fever swept through in '73, took half the settlement, including Sarah." Orion's voice was flat, emotionless, as if reciting facts from someone else's life. "I buried her and rode out the next day, haven't stayed in one place more than a month since." "You buried your dreams with her," Amelia observed quietly. Orion looked at her sharply. No one had ever put it quite so directly before. "I suppose I did." The barn was coming along nicely. What had been a skeleton of posts when Orion arrived was now taking shape as a solid structure. The south field, too, had been cleared of rocks and brush, ready for planting. One afternoon, as they worked side by side setting roof beams, a summer storm blew in suddenly. They raced for the cabin, laughing as they dodged raindrops that quickly turned to a downpour. Inside, soaked and breathless, they found themselves standing closer than they ever had before. Orion became acutely aware of Amelia, her flushed cheeks, the rise and fall of her chest as she caught her breath, the way her wet clothing clung to her frame. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was ready to name. Then Amelia stepped away, busying herself with stoking the fire. "You should change before you catch your death," she said, her voice unnaturally bright. "I'll make some coffee." That night, long after Amelia had gone to bed, Orion sat on the porch watching the storm pass. His thoughts were a tangled mess. Tomorrow marked 2 weeks since he'd agreed to stay. The work was nearly done, which meant it was time to move on just as he always did. But for the first time in 5 years, the thought of riding away left him feeling hollow. The next morning brought clear skies and an unspoken tension. They worked in silence, both aware of the approaching deadline but neither willing to address it. As sunset approached, the final beam of the barn was set in place. "Looks like we finished just in time," Orion said, wiping sweat from his brow as they stood back to admire their work. "Yes, just in time," Amelia echoed, but her eyes were on him, not the barn. That evening, as they sat down to what would be their last meal together, Amelia finally broke the silence. "You could stay, you know." Orion looked up from his plate. "I'm not one for settling down anymore. Aren't you tired of running, Orion?" "Because that's what you've been doing, running from her ghost." Her directness stunned him. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said defensively. "Don't I?" Amelia's eyes flashed. "You think you're the only one who's lost someone, the only one who's had dreams shattered. At least you had the luxury of riding away. Some of us had to stay and face our ghosts every day. It's not the same, no, it's not. You chose to bury your future along with your wife. I didn't have that choice." Orion stood abruptly. "I'll be gone by morning." "Running again," Amelia said softly. "Just like I thought." He stormed out to the porch, anger and grief warring within him. The nerve of her, to think she understood his pain, to suggest he was a coward for not being able to face it. Hours passed as he sat alone in the darkness. Eventually, the door opened and Amelia joined him, offering a cup of coffee as a peace offering. "I'm sorry," she said. "I had no right to speak to you that way." Orion accepted the cup with a nod. You weren't entirely wrong. They sat in silence for a while, the night sounds of the desert surrounding them. When Jacob died, Amelia finally said, I wanted to leave too, go back east maybe, start over somewhere people didn't know me as the widow Hayes. She paused, but I couldn't abandon what we'd built. It felt like betraying him. It's different for everyone, Orion said quietly, maybe. She turned to look at him directly. But I've watched you these past 2 weeks, Orion. You come alive when you're building something. Your hands were made to create, not just to hold reins or a gun. Her words struck uncomfortably close to home. It was true that the work had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years, a sense of purpose, of pride in creating something lasting. Sarah would want you to live, wouldn't she? Amelia pressed gently. To build the dreams you shared with her, even if she can't be part of them. The question hung in the air between them. Orion had never considered that continuing those dreams might be a way of honoring Sarah rather than betraying her memory. You said you buried your dreams with your wife, Amelia continued softly. Then let me dig them out. The boldness of her statement caught him off guard. What do you mean, stay, Orion? Not just for a few more weeks. Stay and help me make this place what it could be. Her voice grew stronger. I'm not asking you to forget her. I'm asking you to remember what made you happy once and give it another chance. Orion looked out at the land at the barn they'd built together, at the fields waiting to be planted, at the creek that caught the moonlight like scattered silver. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future here. I don't know if I can, he admitted. You don't have to know tonight, Amelia replied. Just don't ride away tomorrow without being sure. Morning came, and Orion had his horse saddled before dawn. He'd packed his few belongings and left a note thanking Amelia for her hospitality. It was easier this way, no awkward goodbyes, no chance for her to try to convince him to stay. He mounted up just as the first rays of sun crested the eastern hills, painting the landscape in gold. The beauty of it made him pause. In the soft morning light, he could see the potential of this place more clearly than ever, the fields that could feed a family, the barn that could house horses like the ones he'd once dreamed of breeding, the cabin that could become a real home with a few improvements. And standing on the porch, watching him silently, was Amelia. Orion hadn't expected her to be awake. Her presence disrupted his clean getaway, forced him to face what he was leaving behind. So you're going after all, she said, no accusation in her voice, just a quiet resignation. He nodded, unable to find words. Before you go, I want to show you something. She stepped down from the porch and walked toward the creek, not looking back to see if he followed. After a moment's hesitation, Orion dismounted and trailed after her. They walked in silence until they reached a bend in the creek where the water pooled deeply before continuing on its way. Jacob found something here the week before he died, Amelia said, kneeling by the water. He was so excited he couldn't sleep. She reached into the pool and pulled out a handful of wet sand, then began to sift through it carefully. What are you doing? Showing you that sometimes dreams aren't as buried as we think they are. She held out her hand. In her palm lay several small, unmistakable gold flecks. Orion stared in disbelief. There really is gold here. Not enough to make us rich, Amelia clarified, but enough to build something real. Jacob wasn't completely wrong about this place. She stood, brushing the sand from her hands. I've been saving what I find. In another year, I'll have enough to expand the cabin, maybe buy some proper breeding stock. Why are you showing me this? Because I want you to understand what you're riding away from. Her eyes held his steadily. Not just me, Orion, but a chance to build something that lasts, something meaningful. For the first time, Orion allowed himself to really look at Amelia not as a widow in need of help or a temporary employer, but as a woman. Strong, stubborn, and undeniably beautiful in the morning light. A woman who had faced loss and chosen to keep building anyway, I'm afraid, he admitted finally. Of what? Of caring about something again, someone, and losing it all a second time. Amelia stepped closer. That's the risk we all take, Orion. Living means risking loss. But the alternative is not living at all, he finished for her. Just existing. Yes. She reached out tentatively and placed her hand on his arm. I'm not asking you to forget Sarah. I would never want you to do that, just as I'll never forget Jacob. But there's room in a heart for more than one love. Orion looked back toward the cabin and barn, then down at the gold flecks still clinging to Amelia's damp hand, and finally into her hopeful eyes. 1 month, he said. I'll stay 1 more month after that. After that, we'll see, Amelia finished, a smile breaking across her face like sunrise. The month stretched into 2, then 3. Summer faded into fall, and with the changing season came a transformation in Orion as well. He built fences, repaired the cabin's roof, and constructed a proper well. Each project seemed to restore a piece of himself that had been missing for years. In the evenings, he and Amelia would sit on the porch, planning improvements and sharing stories. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. Other times they spoke of their lost loves, keeping their memories alive even as they created new ones together. The first time Orion kissed Amelia was on a crisp October evening after they'd spent the day harvesting the small crop of corn they'd planted in the south field. It happened naturally, without planning or hesitation, as if their bodies had made the decision while their minds were still catching up. I should have done that weeks ago, Orion murmured against her lips. Yes, you should have, Amelia agreed with a smile. As winter approached, Orion officially moved from the barn loft where he'd been sleeping into the cabin. They weren't married yet, and both were aware of how such an arrangement might appear to others. But they were miles from the nearest neighbor, and the practical benefits of sharing the warmth of one hearth outweighed concerns about propriety. One snowy December night, as they lay together beneath a pile of quilts, Amelia propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. Are you happy here, Orion? He considered the question seriously. I am, more than I thought possible again. Then why haven't you unpacked that? She nodded toward his saddlebag, which still sat in the corner of the room, ready for a quick departure if needed. Orion followed her gaze. He hadn't even realized he'd kept it packed all these months, a subconscious safety net, perhaps. Old habits, he said finally. Amelia settled back against him. Seems to me a man planning to stay would unpack his bags. The next morning, Orion rode to the nearest town, a 2-day journey each way. He returned with supplies, seeds for spring planting, and a simple gold band that he presented to Amelia on Christmas Eve. I can't promise it will be easy, he told her as he slipped the ring onto her finger, but I can promise I won't run when things get hard. That's all I need to know, she replied, kissing him deeply. They were married by a traveling preacher in early spring of 1879, with a handful of neighbors from distant homesteads as witnesses. The celebration was modest but joyful, marked by music from a borrowed fiddle and a feast that depleted their winter stores but felt worth every bite. That night, as husband and wife, they sat on their porch watching the stars, Amelia nestled against Orion's chest. I have something to show you, she said suddenly, standing and taking his hand. She led him to a spot behind the barn he'd never noticed before, 2 simple wooden crosses standing side by side. Jacob, she explained, pointing to one. And the other is for Sarah. I know she's not really here, but I thought you might want a place to visit her sometimes. To talk to her. Emotion welled up in Orion's throat, making it impossible to speak. He squeezed Amelia's hand instead, hoping she understood what this gesture meant to him. They brought us together in a way, Amelia continued softly. I like to think they'd be happy for us. I think they would, Orion agreed when he found his voice again. The years that followed brought challenges, as life on the frontier always did. Drought struck in their 2nd year together, threatening the crops and livestock. Bandits attempted to raid their growing herd of horses in the 3rd year, leading to a tense standoff that ended without bloodshed but left them both shaken. Through it all, they faced each challenge together, drawing strength from each other and from the life they were building. The gold from the creek, while never producing the fortune Jacob had dreamed of, provided enough supplemental income to expand their operations gradually. By 1885, the Rhodes homestead had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. The original cabin had been expanded into a proper house, The barn housed 12 fine breeding horses, and their reputation for fair dealings had spread throughout the region. Most precious of all was their daughter, Sarah Jacoba Rhodes, born in the harsh winter of 1881, followed by their son Thomas in 1883. The children brought a completeness to their lives that neither had dared to hope for in their darkest days. One evening in the summer of 1887, nearly 10 years after Orion had first ridden onto Amelia's claim, they sat on the porch watching their children chase fireflies in the twilight. "Do you ever regret it?" Amelia asked suddenly. "Staying, I mean." Orion looked at his wife, still beautiful at 40, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, laugh lines framing eyes that had seen both sorrow and joy. "Not for a single day," he answered truthfully. "Even when I made you rebuild the chicken coop 3 times because it wasn't just right." She teased. "Well, maybe for a few hours here and there," he conceded with a chuckle. They fell into a comfortable silence, listening to their children's laughter and the evening chorus of desert creatures. "You saved me, you know," Orion said after a while, "when you said you'd dig out my dreams." "We saved each other," Amelia corrected. "That's what love does when it's real," Orion nodded, thinking of how far they'd come from that first confrontation with Amelia's gun pointed at his chest, how many memories they'd created together, how much life they'd lived. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not letting me ride away." "Thank you for staying," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Later that night, as Amelia slept peacefully beside him, Orion lay awake thinking about the strange workings of fate. How losing Sarah had nearly destroyed him, yet ultimately led him to this life he treasured. How Amelia's own loss had prepared her to understand his grief in a way no one else could. They had both buried dreams once, but together they had unearthed new ones, even more beautiful for having been forged through suffering and resilience. Outside their window, the desert stretched vast and mysterious under the moon's glow, the same view that had captured Orion's attention on that first evening so long ago. But now, instead of seeing only what he had lost, he saw all that he had found: a home, a family, a purpose. A second chance at dreams he'd thought were forever beyond his reach. With that comforting thought, Orion Rhodes, no longer a drifting cowboy, but a man firmly rooted in the life he'd built, closed his eyes and drifted into peaceful sleep beside the woman who had dared to dig up what he'd buried.